guess more of the ground level uh, activity, and trying to, and I'm looking more at big picture, large picture, however you want to talk about it. My interest in this is to answer questions and to try to have a conversation. I have some slides, but um, I didn't know how you, I mean, I want to learn from you as well. So if you have any questions, or you want to challenge any of the information that I've got, I would really appreciate it. It's all based on, everything that I've done is based on talking with people in the community and the groups of cemeteries that we've been working with. And each day we find a new thread, a new conversation. Tracy and I will spend hours, some days, too many times, talking on the phone, trying to figure out what directions to go in. And so that's, my idea of having this conversation is a conversation. So feel free to jump in and ask a question, and if you feel more comfortable, I can go ahead and throw some slides up and see where that takes you as well. And so I'll leave it up to you. Anybody want to have any comments or questions at this point and want to start this conversation?
Sure, I'll go first. I'll ask a question that people frequently ask me, and that is, or a two-part maybe, is how and why did you get started in this particular project?
The short story is, we started back when I retired and Georgianne retired. We started looking at our own families, and we're not from Alabama. We're not from the South. My dad passed away and had left a whole pile of paperwork that he'd done going through microfilms and libraries, paper material. I started looking at the families, trying to find the graves of my grandfather, great grandfather, and so forth online, and that took us down a pathway of using Find a Grave in a way that it's set up for, which is we volunteered to take photographs in cemeteries here in Mobile, and people found a lot of ours go back. Some of mine go back to the 1600s, late 1600s, and in Massachusetts. The storyline is that we got people asking for photos here, so we started working there. And there was a lanyard story in the on the OakLawn preservation that Eddie Irby had started here locally, and the veterans group that was looking for veterans, and they had picked on OakLawn. And I think it was around that a week or the same weekend that it came out, we were over at a Catholic cemetery looking for the grave of a child that a family member out of Montgomery was looking for. Her mother had macular degeneration, so she was hoping to find the grave of the baby that had died after birth. And the mother wanted to see the grave one more time, and they had been down numerous times and couldn't find it. And I talked to the cemetery manager, and the short part of it is we ended up probing the area that the cemetery manager said she thought it was in. And sure enough, we found about 5 or 6 children's headstones buried deep under the thatch, next to the pine tree that the mother recalled. And the pine tree was huge, obviously. Many years had gone by. And then we saw across the fence the commotion over OakLawn. And we drove over there, and we never left. OakLawn was chest high in weeds and grass and brush, and they were working over there. And we sat down and said, wow, it's a huge problem. And said, well, let's start figuring out, is there a plan? There was no plan. The only plan that was there was they wanted to identify all the veteran graves. and they had about 600-700 already identified by just walking through the cemetery, cutting brush, cutting trails. And I said, what about all the other graves? And they said their interest is strictly in identifying the veterans. And in order to get there, they're going to clear areas. So we decided to take on the others. There's, right now they're at somewhere around 1,000. I think I don't have the accurate figure, but it's 900 or 1,000 veterans that are buried out there. And we're at 13,000 graves so far that have been identified. We estimate there's probably another 3,000 or more, maybe 4,000, because about a third of the cemetery is still has not been cleared enough to be able to really identify the rows and the markers and how the pattern flows. But we started marking rows, photographing and systematically, and then uploading everything in Find a Grave. So that's how we started, and that has taken us to St. Austin's next. It took us to Tracy somewhere along the way, and St. Austin's, which is 2 blocks away, is just stunning. Historically it was a 7-acre cemetery according to what we found, but it's 3 acres today. It's completely surrounded by homes, except for a small 15-foot, it's about 15-foot wide roadway into it from Martin Luther King Boulevard. It is completely overgrown. I mean, literally all treed, as dense as it can get. Tracy's been out there. You were with us on the when we took the archaeologist out there from the state, right? And Anderson Flynn from the Africtown Historic Preservation Foundation. And we pointed out it is a public relations nightmare in many ways. And I don't know if it's bad for the neighborhood. It's a challenge for the neighborhood. It's a challenge for us. It's a challenge for the community because there are severely damaged graves in that cemetery. And to get in there and to do any work, it's going to require a lot of equipment and a lot of money and a lot of personnel to try to deal with it. So we've documented it. We're trying to keep track of it, and we moved on. I met Eric Finley. He took us on the African American Heritage Trail with Lynn Olshoe, who did a story on OakLawn and St. Austin's and the veterans. And the scenario there is that he told us, I mean, we spent about 4 hours one day with him doing the African American Heritage Trail, and just, I mean, Davis Avenue story came out, all of the connections that we were seeing in OakLawn Cemetery. That's how we got started, and it cascaded into the next, and trying to figure out what to do. And each time I wrote down as many notes as I could. I shared them with as many people as we could. And that context story that I wrote, I'd been writing that since 2018, trying to figure it out. The story basically started with the graves. Georgianne is very interested in the family and had been writing stories, had written up some material on OakLawn's, those who were buried there. We're trying to do the same thing for Plateau. Plateau has become a center point for us in some ways because it is one of the most organized approaches to these cemeteries, and it has a foundation set up. It's going to take a foundation. It's going to take a community-wide interest. All these cemeteries are connected, and that they have to be addressed as a individually, but as well as part of a systematic way of addressing them. So. At least that's where I sit right now. So any other questions? Thoughts?
Yes, let me ask a question before,
Sure.
while you're able to hear me, because may go out a little bit. The can you talk about how cemeteries can be used, for documentation, research, and what are the limitations of that
Um,
when it comes to a resource for
wow.
documentation?
Documentation, you mean documenting the cemetery histories and the people in?
Yes, and
Yeah.
as well as using it as documentation for family history, for the cemeteries themselves,
Everything
some of the
in
limitations.
thing to do with heritage studies can be done starting at the cemetery level or the other way. We start with the headstones, and in the case of the cemeteries who are abandoned, which is OakLawn, St. Austin's, for sure, that we had basically just started weed eating around headstones. We started trying to mow areas, and that for us was too much, but there was groups that were trying to do it. So as people started to mow, we set up a strategy of numbering rows, looking at it and figuring out a rational approach. You could see the rows if you mowed, so you could look at if you're going to start with the cemetery and the grounds, then there's some logistical issues that you could deal with, but we dealt with it. And then we started photographing and started trying to lay it out. We came at it with a level of ignorance on it, not realizing what it would turn into. Going back now, there are things that I would do better. We didn't do anything I don't see as wrong. It just was like, you develop your technique as you go along. We used Ancestry, Family Search, big time. We went to the library, the local history library. They are so amazing at finding and helping with information. But they help a lot of people, so they're not going to be what I'd say boots on the ground. They will be more of that background. They can direct us in the right direction. Research, I mean, the entire history, African American history of Davis Avenue is in OakLawn to a great extent, but it's also connected to the history of Africatown, because there's Isaiah Whitley, I believe his wife and a child are buried in OakLawn. There are various connections to some of the descendants in OakLawn, that family members. It's family, it is connections. So how you tie all of these elements together, it needs to be mapped. It needs to be thought through. Looking at the ownership history. I mean, and right now there's some great material for a PhD or a master's or even a honors thesis or any kind of reporting work that somebody would want to do on all of this. You've got the veterans, you've got educators, you've got lawyers, you've got a lot of engineers, it's just an amazing history document. Then looking at the future, I mean, how does this tie to communities? One of the things that Tracy and I have been talking recently that we were learning about is that these cemeteries, we found a little cemetery down about 13 minutes from our house called Laurendine Cemetery. And as I was digging through the information on it and looking at its history, it is an African-American cemetery sitting on the south side of Mobile. At the time, it was way out in the county. It still is in the county. And it was tied to, the Bay, Mobile, what is it? The Bay Shore Railroad. It's Laurendine was a stop, was a flag stop on the railroad in part. And it's tied to Lloyd Station. Lloyd Station, we were having a big discussion about Lloyd Station, which is again a railroad stop. And there you have Morningside Cemetery, which is African American, but we were trying to find Lloyd Station Cemetery, and we think we finally figured it out that it's Richardson Cemetery, which until January of this year we didn't know existed, other than possibly on paper, which is tied to the families of the Vernon Crawford family, the Richardson family, the Fraser family, and it was on private land that came into ownership of Percy Richardson back in the late 1880s. About 45 acres, and the cemetery is about a half an acre. It was a family community cemetery that was nearly cut in half or destroyed by I-10, by the way. So again, tying to your question, yeah, this just keeps getting bigger, larger and larger and wider. So I was trying to draw a Venn diagram of, we've got churches at the center, we've got churches and cemeteries kind of in this center or wider picture. Plateau Cemetery, there are 4 churches that historically have been tied to that cemetery. OakLawn, there's a couple of them that are nearby, Treevine and Carver Homes Baptist Church, but all the other churches in the community that have been involved. You've got the local communities around them, or in a wider sense. You've got then highways like Cedar Point Road, which tied the communities. There's a large segment of Black population that was down there in that area that was into agriculture and farming is a common word that's been used. But I don't know the history well. I'm still trying to understand it. Gaines Fraser is the person that brings it to attention. He's buried at OakLawn, and about, I think 15 or 20 of his family members are buried there. Turns out he owned there was a big, large family farm down about, we were told it's about 40 to 50 acres on Cedar Point Road. Today Gilliard Elementary School appears to sit on that property. There's supposed to be a family cemetery that was on the farm. We don't know what happened to it. He was tied to the community down there, helped build a church, helped build a school, racetrack school, sometimes called Congress Corner School. It was later integrated into the Mobile County school system. He also helped connect with or build Casher Cemetery, which is an African American cemetery in that area. But his family is also connected to one across Dog River to Richardson Cemetery, very heavily connected. And again, I don't know the history, so I can get carried away with trying to answer questions. So does that help? I think it was Barger that had asked the question. Everybody's on mute, so.
I'm trying to unmute myself here. Wow, that's a lot.
It is huge.
Well, let me ask you this, Jim. I mean, everybody has skill sets,
Right.
that they can bring to this table of cemeteries. Is there a skill set that for all of these across the board? And I know that there are different things that are all needed, but is there a skill set that's most needed for the cemeteries that you're working in?
I mean, more people being involved in I mean, even if they can be involved in going to find a grave, and looking at the memorials that are created there and finding and starting to help identify individuals, write stories about them, connect them. That's something basic that could be done. There's getting, if you live in the area, or even if you don't, the challenge here is, how do we build a community structure that helps tell this story and helps revive that community awareness, and ultimately, I'm hoping, interest in bringing these into a more of an active involvement scenario. OakLawn Cemetery is 18 acres. It sits in a neighborhood. It ties to 3 Mile Creek right down. I mean, it's almost directly adjacent to 3 Mile Creek. It could be a beautiful park in some form. And for the neighborhood, there were people that would, go for walks around on the roadways. I wouldn't encourage, I mean, the roadway is not in good shape. But at the same time, it could be. There's a lot of beauty in the cemetery. People have called it abandoned. It's really awful, but it has beautiful flowers depending on the season. It's wild. It's got rabbits, it's got turtles, it's got birds. There are ways of maintaining a place within a structure that the community would have to be involved in.
Do you think that part of that is cultural, in the sense that, my sister lives in Massachusetts, and she got married in a cemetery. She got married at Mount Auburn.
Right.
But it's considered, it's a local green space park that people use.
Right.
They go out there, they eat their lunch on a bright sunny day, and so how do we bring that concept? And I'm not saying racial, I'm just saying Southern culturally, we don't do that here.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, going back to that question too, is that, there's Magnolia Cemetery. It's not I wouldn't say it's I'd get in trouble if I start talking about culture. Because I'm not totally certain how to ascribe a specific cultural. I'll say, in the broader question is, the cemeteries in Mobile have never been respected. As far as Magnolia Cemetery's history, Church Street Cemetery, the city is, to my knowledge, and to what I've been reading about, the city has never had an interest in its cemeteries, period. Including Church Street. It may ascribe an interest in it, but I have not seen the effort by the city or even the county, although I will say this much. Merceria Ludgood is doing miracles trying to bring cultural awareness into the daylight here. She is, as a county commissioner, has been absolutely stunning. And I worry so much because she's really doing a good job, and it's so person-centric right now. It needs to be broadened into a community-wide discussion. It needs to be broadened into a community-wide participation. So it is a cultural thing if you think of it in the broader sense.
Yeah.
The city has never developed a culture around it. Cemeteries, I mean, if you think about the Campo Santo downtown, I don't know much history on it, although I heard they needed to build the cathedral down there and other businesses, so they moved graves. Well, did they move them or not is a good question. That's a good research project. Then Church Street came into being, and then Church Street it was poorly I mean, it was small, it was designed for its time, but too small. And then they moved to Magnolia, and then Magnolia became a problem in the 1980s, and the Friends of Magnolia became involved. The city knew how to establish endowments and so forth at that time. But again, it can't be all friends of, it can't be all a unitary kind of responsibility. It's got to be a broader community sensed responsibility to become involved, and not just involved to criticize, but involved to actively engage in doing it.
Mhm.
I'm preaching, sorry.
No, I'm lit. No, I'm deep in thought while you're preaching. So let me just stretch this in a different direction, because I know I stepped away for a few minutes, but you're not, I know this conversation today is mostly Mobile cemeteries, but how far out are you working? North, south, east, west. How far are you? I mean,
Don't go there. OakLawn took us to Choctaw County. And
Ow.
little, huh?
How did OakLawn get you to Choctaw County?
Well, a family in with family ties, 93, I think she was 93 years old. She had 2 lots in OakLawn Cemetery. She was trying to figure out where they are because she did not need them any further. Her husband was Charles Lott. He played, I think it was the trombone for the Excelsior band here in Mobile. And he's a veteran, and he's buried out at Spanish Fort. And so she's going to be buried with him at Spanish Fort at the Veterans Cemetery. So she had 2 certificates, and she wanted to know where they were so she could transfer them to her. She didn't have any children, so she's going to transfer them to one of her nieces for them to use if they wanted them. And then in talking to her, she took us to another family member's grave that she remembered. And he was in the back of the cemetery. His grave's unmarked. She remembers going to it. She remembered the general area. She walked back down there. I remember that day. She wanted to walk. And Georgianne walked with her, and I drove the truck down to the back. And she pointed out the area. And I said, do you have anything to tell us next to where, what, who? And she called us a little later and said, yeah, I have some notes that I took when I was at his gravesite when he was buried. And she had written down the names of the headstones next to it. And she still had that piece of paper. And it turned out, then talking to her, her mother, her father, many of her family members are buried in a little cemetery up in Choctaw County. And we looked it up. It was called Little Place Cemetery. It's mismarked and it was mislabeled in Find a Grave as Little Cemetery. It was mislabeled by surveys over the years. It had never been documented or photographed. And we met her and one of her family members up there, and a family member who's taking care of the cemetery. And it was an amazing little cemetery. It's about I'm wanting to say it's about a little over 2 acres, and it sits on the top of a hill with a 100-mile view. It's just incredible, and it goes back to the history of Choctaw County. So we got that far, and now we're doing this. We're doing the same thing. Somebody got us some information about Kaiser Cemetery in Choctaw County. Wasn't that you, Tracy? You were somewhere along the way. You're on mute, Tracy.
No, that was not me.
or it was Georgianne, or somewhere along the way we got. But again, these are all tied together. This again to the original question. Yes, there's research here. The story of Mobile is the story of Southern Alabama, the migration of people. People came here to work, came here for a living, and the cemeteries are taking us back up that roadway. We went down to Laurendine, which isn't, it's outside of the city, but it's telling us part of that story. I don't know how far we want to go at this point. The story of African American cemeteries and how they're being rediscovered, and the tragedies of them, but also the wonderful histories of the families and the communities. I just don't see it being told here. And and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm just, at least coming from the cemetery standpoint, that's where I'm coming from. I'm learning every day at things that I never learned in school, at college or otherwise. I learned more about Latin America. Of course, I grew up in Argentina, but I did learn. I go to school, and it was a British operated school in Argentina. It was so you learn the colonial histories as well, and then you come back to the States and you learn the Southern history and the Chicago history. But I don't know. I can't answer that question. Where it's going to take us, I don't know. I appreciated your efforts, and your organization's efforts to try to contextualize the story, because it's really important. And the other part of the story, I have a question for you, all of you. I was asked a question yesterday by the veterans group here as to how do you define, how do you define a predominantly African American cemetery? How do you know a cemetery is a Black cemetery? How do you know a cemetery's a Creole cemetery? And I'm going to give them the answer, but the Historic Commission, I don't think has a definition for it, because they allow now a checkbox on the historic cemetery registry that can be checked. And so they're relying on crowdsourcing, I think, in the sense of it's based on those who submit the information. But I'd ask the question, are there Creole heritage people buried in Plateau, in OakLawn, St. Austin's, Magnolia, Church Street, Laurendine, Richardson? I can't answer that question. I'm not sure I understand how to answer it yet, but I think it's quite, I understand what Tracy, you showed us that in Church Street Cemetery, and beginning to understand it. But then back to the question, and I have an answer for how do I answer the question about predominantly Black cemetery. I have a hunch that Magnolia Cemetery has a large population of Black burials in it, because, and I'm fairly comfortable in saying that. But every time somebody asks a question about doing a survey from the public news stories, say, well, we don't know how many Blacks are buried in Magnolia because we don't keep records by race. And that's partially true answer. Accurate answer. I wouldn't say true or false. It's a partially accurate answer that they do not, and a lot of these cemeteries don't have that as a characteristic. But as Tracy will tell you, And as we learned, the death records all have that going back many, many years of the death records are there. And it does identify that, based on the criteria that are used for death records. So we go by predominance of evidence, and evidence is showing that OakLawn is predominantly, I would say it's a African American cemetery. Can I guarantee that there are no people of white background or heritage in that cemetery? No.
Yeah.
I can't. And same thing with Plateau, same thing with, but then I come up with the question, how do I identify Creole burials? And that may be a very sensitive
You
question.
leave that to Chris.
Thank you,
Chris,
Tracy.
Chris, you're now the expert. Please help. But I will turn it over to you to do that. But you know, is there a value in, I mean, you can get into the politically charged conversation about why is it important to differentiate? And I'm not saying that I'm going to go there, but it is extremely important to know the history and the communities which these cemeteries serve, and therefore it's important to have definitions to some of these questions. It's not to use them one way or the other, it's to use them in a way to talk about the history.
Well, can I share with you something? I don't think I told you this. Do you remember the one single death certificate that I found for Lincoln that was a white child?
Yeah.
They got it wrong. So as it turns out, I found, because he was Luther Wells Jr., who was being buried in Lincoln Cemetery. But I found where Luther Wells Sr. was actually purchasing lots in Greenmound. And so the mix and the confusion over those two cemeteries existed at the time, probably almost as much as it's existing for me, trying to untangle it all.
Yeah. So what was he?
He was white. He was buried in Greenmound.
In Greenmound.
And
Okay.
not in,
I'm sorry, I had to ask because I wanted to be sure.
No, I mean, no, because you know, so they just wrote Lincoln because that mass is still considered Lincoln Cemetery, Lincoln Realty, Lincoln everything else. And whoever was filling it out wrote Lincoln.
And
here on Mobile Street.
I was thinking of another, the reason I asked is because I was thinking of a different answer, which is, could they have written white on there when in fact it wasn't a white child? It was a child of a mixed marriage.
Yeah, and I thought about that too.
And we've seen that terminology throughout some of the death records. But there's a whole study there of death records that is just enormously important, telling the history. There's health related information on death records going back a long time. There's community, I mean, it's really a but yeah. And I've seen some there have been, I can't say which cemetery at this point, my brain is fried on that. But people who were born abroad in, say, the Caribbean or even Latin American, there are some names that are very Latin American, and so I don't know, you know, even in OakLawn, they could be, again, culturally and heritage-wise, they could be from a different group or different heritage, and they were buried in OakLawn, which is, there's nothing right or wrong about it. It's just, I'm just saying that there's part of the study, part of the understanding that has to come through. Just like any cemetery, that you will see that same kind of question for, especially down here, which has such a historically rich, multinational and multicultural diversity to it. Going back to the British and the French and the Spanish and the Native Americans. Same thing with religion. We do know of one headstone that has a Jewish headstone. So, you know, where are the religious implications? St. Austin's Cemetery. It's named St. Austin's. It's had a benevolent association associated with it over the years. And going back in history to the Mutual Aid Society, I think of Mobile, and then St. Austin's Benevolent Society. St. Austin is and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not good at religion. St. Austin is St. Augustine.
Mhm.
St. Augustine is believed to have been of African heritage, dark skin. There's a history there that's well written. And so how did that come? I don't find a church tied to that. There has to be possibly, or not. I just don't know how it became connected. But the minute I say St. Austin's, a lot of people in the community say St. Augustine's. And now I understand why.
And I had always thought there was a man named Henry Austin who was an undertaker.
Oh,
And
wait.
I always thought that there, yeah. So,
I never thought of that. I mean, I have another question. There's all these funeral homes that are tied in, and Knox Funeral Home, I believe it started in 1910, roughly. Georgiana was looking at the history of funeral homes. There's a Knox Funeral Home here in Maysville, I believe, that she found information on, and I don't know the history of that funeral home, but it's big time. It has a lot of burials associated with Plateau, with OakLawn, and so forth. And the question then is, are these strictly African American owned funeral homes who were burying predominantly in Black cemeteries? Or what's their heritage? Because and I'll go deep here. OakLawn Cemetery's origins tie to a group of white investors. And one of them, Noel Turner, I believe, was tied to Higgins Funeral Home, which was definitely a white owned funeral home in the early years of Mobile. So then it's tied to the Allens, to the Johnson Allens, the Lovetts, I'm trying to think of the major ones. Christian Benevolent is huge. It's very, very, it stands out very strongly. It's I think 1920s when it was started. So again, that whole history hasn't been written, and we've got enough ledger information and burial records, death records, and so forth that could tell that story. And I'm not saying it's a good or bad story. I'm just saying, the one that I kept missing, A.J. Gaston. People are familiar with the history of A.J. Gaston out of Birmingham, the Black millionaire of his time period. He began Smith and Gaston Funeral Home. There was 13 funeral homes here in Alabama, and Taylor Hodge of Hodges Funeral Home here in Mobile was his funeral director for many years of the 13 funeral homes. And he started Hodges Funeral Chapel here in Mobile, which went out of business about 2 years ago. And all those records are gone as far as we know, unless somebody has a connection to someone who might be able to find those. funeral home records are disappointingly hard to get, and by state law, they're only required to keep 4 years worth of records. So anyway, sorry, I digress.
No, but you were just talking, because you started off talking about Knott's Funeral
Right.
Home, and you were asking about what, I know you weren't asking whether or not they were an African American funeral home.
I am.
You are, yes, they were.
And that's the understanding, but there's one is the one in Maysville a descendant of the one that we're talking about that was doing burials in the early 1900s, and
The early 1900s was Henry Knox and James Knox, and there might have been a third brother.
Right.
I don't know, but I can ask Paulette and
right.
see what she knows. She and her daughter Georgette, they've offered to sit down and do an oral history
Whoa,
with us.
that'd be great. That'd be great.
So
Please
yes,
do that.
we will-
Because I think the
we will-
history of the funeral home business is important. It has very strong ties to the African American community and especially to the cemeteries.
And one you did not mention that I've come across in advertising, and then in the one burial, well, no, in safety banking,
Oh, yeah.
advertising is Albert Boyd.
Right.
So
had
that's
never
another
come
one.
across it.
Yeah. So, and I see him in advertising for Mobile in other newspapers and other locations. But his stenographer was Sarah Jane Hatcher Duncan,
Right.
of the Bethel AME Church
Okay.
that led the women's auxiliary
And you see,
nationally.
we come back to the churches.
And we
It's
come back.
all, it's a very broad connection all across the community. It tells a story of the communities. And frankly, it tells an amazing story about a community that made Mobile possible, and it's not being told.
Jim, I know you had a number of slides.
I don't need slides. But again, if anybody has questions, please, unmute yourself. Please tell me I'm wrong. Please tell me what other directions it can go in. I am not trying to be an expert on any of this.
Well, let me ask this, because we've got some people from out of town. Those of you who live elsewhere, do you have family members who are buried in some of these cemeteries, whether it be OakLawn or Chastang or Seymour's Bluff or St. Austin's? Have you encountered family members that are buried there when you do your family history? Fatima, you want to turn your mic on?
Yeah, I do have but quite a bit of people, I think, in OakLawn. And I think what is always confusing to me in doing the family history, when you pull up the records, they're all tied to Magnolia, but they're not buried necessarily in Magnolia. They're in some other part, such as OakLawn and that kind of stuff. But I think the last newsletter we had kind of explained that a little bit. So I found that to be very interesting.
Yeah, I was going to say, please share the names so that I can double check our records as we're trying to create them. Because yeah, the oldest burials that we have, the 1917 burial that's in OakLawn, it was buried in, that person was buried in Magnolia and transferred to OakLawn in 1947 or in the 1940s. So there was movement between cemeteries, just like Hank Aaron's family was buried originally in OakLawn. His father and his two sisters were buried in OakLawn. When his mother died, they moved them all to Magnolia. So there's some movement between cemeteries. And we have the unusual circumstances of, Georgianne can share this later, but, and I don't know if she wants me to share. But we have a death record that says the person is buried in Plateau Cemetery and an obituary that says they're buried in OakLawn.
Mhm.
And we have no records in either cemetery. So, or I shouldn't say no records, no headstones. And the ledgers aren't coming up with any information. So what do you do? And I'm almost of the opinion that we need to create two memorials, cross-linking them and find a grave, so that families, when they start going down these trails, can understand that, you know, we're not sure. Until we can find some more evidence. So again, how would you feel as family members or as individuals in the community? If the death record says one cemetery and the obituary says another cemetery, the obituary usually comes out after the death record. So which one would you want to believe in more? Is that part of the story that you're seeing, Fatima?
I think so. I mean, it sounds familiar in looking at things where, like you said, you know, the death record does sometimes may have one thing, and then you look at the obituary and it has something else. And I think for me, I tend to lean towards what's on the obituary, thinking that that
would agree.
possibly came from the funeral home. And maybe there was some change up sometime between the actual death record and the obituary.
That would be my logical, our logical assumption as well. On the other hand, from a data point of view, is trying to make sure all of that is written down somewhere.
Right, right.
Because
Another thing too, Jim, that I thought about last night while I was sorting through death certificates, you know, some of these older death certificates, like, you know, 1910s, 1920s, where they're all handwritten, you know, the funeral home seems to be writing in their own information.
yeah,
So place of burial and the funeral home might be in one particular penmanship, while the doctor's information is in another penmanship, while the general stuff is in the secretary's hand, say, you know. So there's that detail to also take into consideration, you know, when you're looking at all of this. And yes, there, you know, certainly there could be a change between, you know, oh no, that's not where our stuff is, it's actually going to be over here, because so and so finally came up with the paper that said where we can bury them.
yeah. And more recently, you'll see shortly after someone passes away, there'll be an obituary, and then it says, it doesn't say where they're being buried, and then it may never come back as an obituary or an announcement later on. It may just disappear, and that causes, you know, then where is the big question until you find a headstone or a marker. That whole there's a whole paper, essay, stories, books to be written on all of these elements. And I couldn't encourage, I mean, University of South Alabama, I worked there for enough years and at Auburn, and I'm just still, man, there's projects here in town that, you know, could really do the community a lot of justice. Telling these stories and trying to pull all these details out. The Green family name comes alive here. There's some Greens buried out in Richardson Cemetery. I can't remember if they're green with the E on the end or green without the E on the end.
Well,
There's also
the green is my husband, and he's not from Mobile. So
well, I was thinking the Kiwi family connection is there's a green I'm trying to remember his name, out of Texas. He's originally from here. He's a descendant, and I'm always pestering him with questions about greens and he's going, well, it's not that, it's not on my line of the family. And he sent me his family tree and it's like, yeah. I mean, just like the Ellis family.
Mhm.
And, one of the things I think that caught my eye early on was in OakLawn. There are a lot of Ellises buried there.
Mhm.
And that took me down that road of trying to understand the heritage of Ellis family name. And I still don't know. I come out of the line that comes out of, well, came out of Massachusetts to Chicago, and Chicago down to Kansas. And so now I'm trying to figure out how the family name came to be moving around the country. There's a lineage that comes down through the East Coast, one down kind of the Ohio River Valley, down into the South. And yes, it probably is associated with plantations and Southern and the time periods. And, but at the same time, it tells me that we're all connected. Whether we want to be connected or not is the greater challenge. I want to be connected. I want to understand that history. I want to know it. And again, I was just and the plateau. There's Ellis's Alfred and Janice Ellis own a large chunk of the cemetery property up in the northwest corner. And that until recently, people didn't realize that a whole lot of graves are on private property at Plateau Cemetery. Because the property lines are divided out now and we know where they are. And I keep trying to find that history. Telling the story from names is another interesting. I mean, it may be difficult. It's a difficult story for everyone, in many respects, but it's fascinating, to try to figure out all of these connections. And I apologize if I offend anybody in my statements. I'm just learning.
Joyce, do you have people cemeteries that come up more often than not in your family history research?
Yeah, I was just looking. I thought it was the Magnolia Cemetery, where I thought I might have some, but my family was also across the bay there in actually Magnolia Springs, which is a little different, but Magnolia Cemetery. But I'm recognizing the names in the article that was in the mumbo gumbo. I'm definitely recognizing the names, and it seems like they are in the Church Street Cemetery. So, but I just want to say, Jim, I just want to say to you, I really do appreciate your work, your effort, and your time in doing this, because I was just curious. I mean, of course, we all use cemetery records, but just the effort and the time that you have put into this is just invaluable for people now and for future, genealogists as they try to study their families. So I just want to say thank you.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm enjoying doing it because I'm retired. And I'm meeting more people. During the COVID period, we were always enjoying being outdoors. Being in the cemetery was a great place to be, in many ways, because there weren't a lot of crowds. There weren't a lot of people out there. On the other hand, it's sad to see that very few people are able to, enjoy these places, and to come out there and learn. I guess going back to Tracy's comment too, is that there is also some misunderstanding about cemeteries. The kids these days don't learn about them. There may be a fear of them. There may be they're seeing as places of death and negativity and don't realize the story. It's like well, I keep using the term, it's like a library that has a lot of books and none of them have been opened yet. And they're waiting to tell your story. And I think Ty Marston used to have that, if anybody, he was always kidding around about things and he was saying, easy place to learn from somebody, especially if they'll talk to you. And they do. All you have to do is look up their history, their obituaries, their family stories, and they're talking to you. So, but I appreciate the thought. I appreciate all of your support too. And Tracy has been, she's worse than I think.
I'm just along for the ride.
Same here. And Georgianne she's enjoying it. She's very frustrated because, it's just that people aren't, the stories aren't being cared for. And all we can do is what we're doing. We put as much as we can into the library on their records, share it with everybody, write the stories out. So, yeah, go ahead.
I have a question, Jim. Have you ever had an opportunity to do anything at the St. Rose of Lima Cemetery down in Maunui Island?
We've been down there, we've looked at it, and I would say no. And it's not because we don't want to. It's because we've got so much going on up here.
Right.
And it's gotten to the point where it's almost like we have to drop something and stop doing something here, and it's just a matter of time that we'll get down there probably and do some things. But that's a whole other. There's just a lot of cemeteries down in that area. I mean, the driving around in this state, and it may be common in other states, and maybe I have never noticed it, but just like Choctaw County, I swear there's a cemetery on every mile. And if I stopped at every cemetery, I'd move there.
Yeah.
I mean, and here in Mobile, just the number of cemeteries in the city of Mobile in one district. It's the District 2. And they're ignored. I mean, they're in the city of Mobile. They're downtown Mobile, Church Street. I mean, that cemetery is the only city-owned, well, the only one that the city supposedly maintains. And, when I asked the Historic Development Commission people several years ago for records on cemeteries, they were told they only maintain records for those cemeteries that fall in historic districts that the city has created. So Church Street's the only one that does. Magnolia is not considered part of a historic district. It is considered part of a national designated district. But those aren't considered part of the city.
Now, can you tell me which cemetery does Immaculate Conception Cathedral use by chance?
That I can't tell you off the top of my head.
Okay.
If it's any, I mean, the Catholic Church uses the Catholic owns
Its own.
its own cemetery, historic cemetery. So there are a lot of burials out there, but that's mixed burials as well, as my understanding.
Denise, have you not been to Catholic Cemetery? When
You say,
yeah.
have I? You say,
Yeah.
have I? Yes. Yes, I've been to St. Rose of Lima and of course Church Street. I don't know if that's Catholic. I don't think that's Catholic.
Oh, Catholic is down off of Martin Luther King Jr. Drive.
Oh, you mean that's actually a cemetery named
Yes,
Catholic?
Catholic Cemetery.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not
It's-
familiar
it's-
with that one.
It's run and
Okay.
owned by the Archdiocese.
Mhm.
Okay,
It's right next to OakLawn. And the reason I know more about it is because there's this confusion that has existed over the years that who owns OakLawn? Catholic Cemetery? No, it doesn't. It has, to our records, it has never owned OakLawn. It's always had a fence between it and OakLawn. There's a chain link fence, which I'd like to see them take it down anyway. I don't like fences in cemeteries. Uh, they at one time, the Archbishop was consolidating all the cemetery property that the church owns in Mobile. And they accidentally, their lawyers made a mistake on paper in transferring over ownership and made it look like they owned OakLawn Cemetery. And I contacted the person there that has been working with us, and she's a dream, Frankie Young. She has, and I said, hey, Frankie, you do know that you now own it. And she said, what? And I said, yeah, it's now in the Mobile County property ownership. And they took a look at it, and their lawyer within a week had that fixed. Somebody had looked at old property titles and they made a mistake in how they read the deeds. The cemetery has never been owned, to my knowledge, and through looking at deeds, has never owned any part of that cemetery.
okay,
But there are blacks buried out there. And and especially there are black burials out there where they could not bury a family member next to their family member in OakLawn because they didn't have a copy of the certificate that they needed. So they ended up burying. In one case that I'm familiar with, the Jacksons, that their mother was buried out at Catholic, and their father and brother is buried in OakLawn, and they recently moved father and brother to Catholic because OakLawn wasn't going anywhere as a cemetery in the sense of supporting. There's no structure to help families out there, and so families have been tending to move graves out if they can if they could afford it, because it's not cheap.
Mhm.
And so they finally have the family reunion at Catholic Cemetery.
Okay.
The Catholic Cemetery here, by the way, has a good website for the management of it, and all their rules and everything is really well done. They own the Archdiocese here in Mobile runs the Catholic Cemetery in Montgomery. So don't when you look at their website here, it'll show the Montgomery Cemetery as well as the one here.
Okay,
But I have not seen the one at St. Rose, so I'm assuming that it's not considered owned by the church.
Yeah, I think it's connected to the parish there, but
Yeah.
I don't know that it's not operated by the archdiocese or maintained by
Right.
the archdiocese.
And again,
But-
that's good history.
But Catholic, Denise, is divided into a historic section and then the new section. And the
Okay.
archdiocese is doing a terrible job of maintaining the older section.
okay,
And I would suggest that that's similar in Magnolia in some ways.
Mhm.
And it's not, I not that they don't try, but it's just, it's really the way the city and the way this whole thing is set up, that there's no emphasis that these are historical resources and that need to be preserved. There's just not a community-wide or effort to make that, and I guess it's going to have to come from the community as opposed to the administration of the cities. I mean, and I'm saying this because if you look at St. Austin, Texas, irony, St. Austin, Texas, they have a huge cemetery. The Park Department is running a major restoration of a cemetery out there. And they're very proud of it. Pensacola, same thing. They have some restoration going on and through the University of West Florida and the city and the park district, the city's parks department, they have been getting large funding amounts to support the restoration. Now, how long it's gonna last, I don't know, but they're doing remarkable work. Even in Florida as a whole, if you look at the Florida Public Archaeology Network, their attention to cemeteries has been absolutely incredible in Florida, and encouraging and promoting historical resources, the cemeteries as historical resources. Again, I'm diverging too many ways, but I see what can be done. I just don't know how to get it done. But again, if you could, send me names, we're welcome, that you may have in each of the cemeteries, even Magnolia. We can see what we've got, and just keep, at least, connect with those names, and see what we've got, if we have any more records or any more information on them.
Thank you.
And please do realize that all of our stuff is in Find a Grave, by way of memorials. We put everything up on, and families, if you have family members in Find a Grave that are there, you can request, and it's your right to request those memorials be transferred to you for management. That's how Find a Grave's primary rule. Number one rule. You can, and if you want information on how to do that, I'll send it to you. I'll email it. You can just email me and I'll explain it to you. Yeah, because that's the basis of their operation.
I just put your email in the chat for everybody. So, all right, so I'm gonna ask one more question and then everybody else, y'all can ask. Did you explain to everybody the really interesting map behind you that you were telling me about early on?
Which one?
The one I'm looking at right behind.
No. Oh, the elephant in the room that nobody's asking questions about. That's Plateau Cemetery. I don't know if you're familiar with the Plateau Cemetery. It's also known as Africatown Cemetery. It's also known as the Africatown Graveyard. And it's also known as the old Africatown Cemetery. And a new cemetery. But it's this is right here is Bay Bridge Cutoff Road, which connects to the Africatown Boulevard. Almost all of the properties along this edge here, this edge here, up here, this is where the Africatown Business District used to be and was destroyed by the Africatown Boulevard construction. The church is off the map up on this side. And they used to have a view from the church into the cemetery. Now this is high ground. The red is high ground. That's the highest area. The old section sits on a ridge that drops down into a drainage ditch here. This is a culvert collector point. I'm not really good at doing this. I can't do weather either. There's a collector point here that the city put in to put a large storm drain that runs from this point all the way through the cemetery over to here and then over to here to carry stormwater from that side of the property, of their property. And it carries runoff from the boulevard, Africatown Boulevard, that's run by LDOT. It runs under here. There's a large drainage system that runs down this backside So what you have is different elevations. This is getting lower. This is the lowest. So that's where water will build up and drain off into this ditch that then comes over here. And the FEMA floodplain runs pretty much all over this entire area of the cemetery. And this is all the floodplain, flood drainage area that runs off into 3 Mile Creek. This is the new section. This is the old section. The new section was started in the 1950s. And they began burying from this point towards the back. The new, most recent graves are in this area here. They pretty much stopped burying or we're under advisement from the city engineers that they were burying in floodplain and they're not supposed to be. And it's very problematic because we've got 20 to 40 graves that sit underwater when it rains a lot in the new section because of the nature of the landfill. This whole area was lowland drainage originally before it became a cemetery. And the coal company owned it. And the current mayor's lumber company owned that land at one time. And then the coal company owned it. And they filled, I can't say who they is, but it was filled. All of this is landfill that was used to fill in to create high ground so that it could bury on top of it. And it's been filled. This is packed higher. And as you move forward, what a lot of it is fill that was, as they buried more graves, they pushed the soil this way and it's lower and lower. So it's kind of a declining landscape. I tell you, this is Dr. Alex Beebe in the geology department at the University of South Alabama, has been doing drone studies, and he did this drone study 2 years ago. Well, it's actually, yeah, 2023 in January, and then he did it again in December. So he's done two. What he's trying to do is trying to determine how much the land is settling and how much is sliding. And the general comment that I heard from a landscape architect is that this area is slowly sliding this way. The weight of the vaults and the compaction in the way the soils are, as long as water is continuing to be allowed to stand on these areas, it's going to slowly erode and slide. Along this ridge, this is high ground. You can see the effects of time, because those are the oldest graves, where a lot of the vaults are sitting high off the ground on a hill, and the farther down you get, I mean, it's like but they're fairly stable. It's just, it's not in our lifetime kind of. I don't think we'll see any, unless we get massive storms. And if we get massive storms, then we could see a lot of damage in this cemetery. But he's trying to help us. He figures over the years he's going to have good, he'll have data, and it's also telling us what we have to be worried about. So again, it's an impressive study that he did, and he shared all his files with us. He's given us all the aerial imagery of all the graves, really, really worthwhile. So, do you have any questions about that? I'd love. We've got maps of OakLawn, large scale like that. The engineering maps, because OakLawn was an engineered cemetery, and they were in the probate records. That map is on the Find a Grave website. If you look at the cemetery photos, I put the map up there. So we're trying to map that out. Any other questions?
I have a question. What's your favorite part of all of this that you do?
Talking to people, enjoying the families, helping the families. It's the favorite part is when we get just a thank you. Or when a family member comes out, starts putting flowers on a grave, or like we have 3 headstones getting ready to be put in Plateau. The daughter of one of the family members, Henderson, her mother is buried in the old section of Plateau. Her grandmother's buried there, and her father's buried there. Her grandmother had no headstone, and the grave is settled. And her father was a veteran whose grave marker was apparently stolen. And she managed to order a new headstone, and it's been delivered. The memorial company has it, and they're waiting for weather to settle down. And then on the other hand, there's a Benny Jackson. His grave is in the new section, and his sons hadn't seen his grave in something like 50 years. They're older, and he has no marker, and they called us and asked us if we could find his grave. They thought they knew where it was, but they didn't have any indications of where it might be. No maps, no photos, no, the memories, only the memories. And they gave us the particulars, and it turns out that Melinda Bounds in 1997 surveyed all the headstones. She and others, I guess, went through all these cemeteries and wrote down the names and date on all the headstones that they could find, and bound it, and it's in the library. And it's not digital, it's paper. So we started doing research on Benny Jackson, and lo and behold, there was no marker, just a name, and it was probably the name that was painted on the vault cover at the time. That was a practice when new graves are buried. There's 1 of 2 ways of doing it. One is to paint the name on the head of the vault so that it sticks for a while. Or like in modern cemeteries, they put out a temporary kind of plaque marker that the cemetery puts out until headstones come in. In this case, we found the graves on either side based on her survey that had headstones. And then we found the ledger information that we have from Plateau Cemetery from 2005 that shows those. So we went out there, and sure enough, there's a vault there, there's a grave there. All of these other graves around it make sense. And so we told the family, all we can tell you is there's a grave that was listed there with that name, and it's the only one in the cemetery that we found with that name. And so I invited them out, and it was really enjoyable because I didn't tell them where we found it, where the location was. And I asked them to just stop in the cemetery and get out and tell me where they were looking. And they were close. They were very close. They had a wider area. He was off on the edge of the wider area, but he was close. When he got out of the truck and we walked over to it, and I said, it's right here. Your memory was close. Because that's how it works. That's fun. Now I can't say 100%, but they have a headstone they've ordered, and it's ready, and it's coming in too. And once that is placed, that's what it's all about. And there's another conversation that I've started out there, and that Anderson and I have talked about, is there are a lot of graves that are unmarked that we'll never find them. We'll never mark them. And so we were trying to figure out a way to deal with that. And I said, there's some empty land on the sides. If we could get some property set aside and have a marker program set up so families can put their names on this, say, memorial wall, memorial plaque area, because we know they're buried there. We just don't know where. The important thing is to remember that they're buried here and their memories, and to have their name there, and hopefully that'll come true. Yeah, Georgiana was telling me about another story. She handed me a message. Tell the story about St. Austin. There was a veteran who was trying to find his father's grave. I think I told Tracy about it. And the daughter talked to us, and we haven't found a lot of headstones in St. Austin's, and we were willing to invite them out, and they came out with us. And when he got out of the car, he says, "Oh, it doesn't have a headstone," and the daughter just about fell over. She apologized. I said, "Don't worry about it." I mean, let's see where your memory takes him. And he had his memory. His memory was pretty good. He knew it was on the far side. He knew about walking in. And but they spent 2 hours with us out there. We went, they went, everybody, we looked everywhere. And we just couldn't find it. And it did not have, he said it did not have a headstone. Well, I think it was a week later, Georgiana and I went back out there to try to get some photos of some headstones, and there was a veterans marker that she wanted to clear so we could know who it was. And it was 3/4 buried, so we couldn't tell from the photos what it was. So she's sitting there, and she cleared it, and she called me, and she said, "Come on over, I found something." And right next to that headstone, she had seen a little piece of granite sticking out of the leaves and underbrush, and she cleared it. It was his father's headstone. The grave that didn't have a headstone actually had a headstone. And right then and there, we called her and told her, and she says, "We know where he is, and he has a headstone." And she, of course, broke out in tears and said, "Can we come out? How fast can we come out?" I said, "How fast can you come out?" They came out, I think it was 2 or 3 days later, they came out, and he passed away shortly after. That's what the story's all about. Sorry, it catches me. That's just great. So, it's the stories that everybody's telling us. And if anybody tells you that people out there aren't talking to us, well, I got news for them. They are, and they're telling their wonderful stories. So I'm getting carried away. I enjoy doing this better than slides, and you got most of this. You got the majority of the story. I'll send the link to the slides, and you can have them, and send them out to everybody.
Okay.
And see if you have, because it's got more maps and stuff. It's more of the technical stuff. It's not fun.
Yeah, add some photos to it.
Add photos to everything. Yes, I know.
Yeah,
I was,
always. Okay, all right. Does anybody else have any more questions?
I
Oh,
was gonna
what,
say, what photo? I mean, which photos? Which photo? You're getting as bad as we are with cemeteries. You know, which story to tell first?
yeah, I know. But yes, yeah, this
Are we
has been
good?
amazing. You're amazing.
No, you all are.
And thank you for doing this for us.
Yeah.
So I put your email in the chat box. So if anybody needs to get that, and if not, just, I think I got it right. elliejam@gmail.com.
I haven't looked at the chat box, but I mean,
You should look and make sure.
you are
that I got
correct.
it. Okay.
And I go by Jim. I go by Jim. You don't have to put the title in there. I only use that if I have to.
I know, but
In certain
you
academic
earned it.
environments.
You earned it, so it's important. Anyway, but thank you for doing this for us. and making yourself available and to continue the research.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, yeah.
And if anybody has projects or kids or children or other families
Send them to Jim.
want to do something, want to take on something, let us know. I mean, we can suggest things. I think it's a great place for teenagers and young kids to learn. Classes are great. If somebody would get started in grade schools, you don't even have to bring them out to the cemetery. We could bring this, people could bring the cemetery to the classroom and give them names, have them to do research, learn genealogy or early on.
Well,
Maybe-
when history is personal, it becomes so much more important.
Yeah.
To our kids, and so. Yeah. But thank you everyone for coming, and I'm excited to see your faces, and I hope you can all come this summer to our reunion, because it's going to be a blast and we're going to have a good time. So thank you, Jim.
Appreciate, I have to thank everyone for the work you're doing with your organization and your families, and for the opportunity to share.
So anytime, so come back again.
Okay.
All right, thanks.
Hey,
Thank
Bye
you.
everyone.
bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.